I worry about the global attitudes to China, and particularly America's attitudes to China. There seems to be a contradiction in American foreign policy, which is so flagrant it ought to be causing, well, I think it is causing a diplomatic whiplash across the international community. On the one hand, the United States continues to escalate its aggressive posturing towards China, economically, militarily, and rhetorically. On the other, it flirts with appeasement towards Russia, even hinting at recognizing its illegal annexation of Crimea. The contrast is not only morally incoherent, but strategically, I think, disastrous. So if we begin with the first principles, since 1945, the post-war order has operated on the sacred assumption that borders cannot be altered by force. And that principle is enshrined in the UN Charter and buttressed by the Geneva Conventions, the Rome Statute, the customary international law. And Russia's seizure of Crimea in 2014 was not a dispute over culture or language. It was a war crime cloaked in referendum theatre. And you can't have a referendum at gunpoint, which is effectively what happened. Under Trump's second administration, the US is considering recognizing Crimea as Russian, a move that would effectively legitimize conquest. And Irina Marchuk of the University of Copenhagen warns that this would destroy war crimes investigations and set a dangerous precedent. Indeed, what Moscow is demanding isn't a peace settlement, but a certificate of ownership. And if granted, it would render all Ukrainian litigation about torture, enforced disappearances, and illegal deportations moot. It isn't diplomacy, it's diplomatic vandalism. Now, some might say, what's the harm of pragmatism? We must end the war. But remember, the 1938 Munich Agreement. Appeasement doesn't bring peace, it whets the appetite of predators. And Nariman Dilio, a former political prisoner from Crimea, now Ukraine's ambassador to Turkey, puts it plainly. If Trump does what he suggested, it's not just terrible from the point of view of global politics, it's terrible for concrete individuals. Recognition of Crimea would mean abandoning the very people still being repressed. It would signal to Russia and to others that the use of force does indeed pay. And contrast this with the US approach to China, where the response to Russian annexation is mollifying, the response to China's economic maneuvers is pugilistic. Tariffs up to 145%, visa crackdowns, bans on semiconductor exports, inflammatory rhetoric about civil unrest in Chinese factories. These aren't just trade policies, they're economic siege tactics. And Trump has accused China of violating trade deals that were barely days old, while his administration targets Chinese students and tech firms under the guise of national security. There is, of course, a legitimate concern about authoritarian overreach and intellectual property theft, but the response has been erratic, excessive, and infused with theatrical rage. And here lies the central absurdity. America punishes China for export controls and supply chain dominance, but excuses Russia for full-scale wars of conquest. It rails against Beijing for South China Sea expansionism, while simultaneously withdrawing support from war crimes tribunals targeting Moscow. This duplicity erodes the moral authority of the United States. As Lauri Malkso, professor of international law in Estonia, observes, where will this set a precedent? Indeed, if Crimea is forfeit, why should Taiwan not be next? If borders can be withdrawn with tanks in Ukraine, why not with gunboats in the South China Sea? Beyond legality and ethics, this is pure strategic folly. Weakening support for Ukraine alienates NATO allies, especially in Eastern Europe. Macron's recent speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue even called out China's hypocrisy, but it's the US whose duplicity is now being watched, or should be watched, with alarm. And Washington's economic war with China risks fracturing global supply chains and dragging allies into a trade war they never signed up for. Even companies like Nvidia are sounding the alarm. The export bans don't stop China, they just accelerate its determination to go it alone. So what should be done? The US must recover its sense of coherence. It's as if it's sort of imagining, what's the worst case scenario? China invades Taiwan. Let's proleptically punish China for that. This is like the Tom Cruise film where you're punished before you've even done the job. It must be If territorial aggression is unacceptable, it must be so across the board, in Crimea, in Donbass, in Taiwan. If economic partnerships are to be rebalanced, they must be managed through clarity, not chaos. We can't be in this halfway house where we say, well, you might invade, you might do this, so we punish you for it anyway. We're watching not just a contradiction in policy, but a collapse in credibility. You cannot punish one aggressor while placating another. You cannot thunder about the rules-based order in Asia while shredding it in Europe. To borrow the words of President Zelensky, there's nothing to talk about here. This is against our Constitution, and it should be against America's too. Not only the constitutional one, but the moral one.